And then just want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Amy, especially for being here for this talk. And I'll hand it over to you, Amy. It's all your show. Oh, and I will mention as well. Feel free to Amy can say how she wants interactions, but if you're ever want to make a mention of some question and you don't feel comfortable open a microphone, you can always type it into the chat. Feel free to use the chat. And if you want, say, one of us to ask the question for you, you can always send a direct private message, and I'll be free to relay it for that if you'd like it that way. And thank you.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks good. Thank you, Amy.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. And yeah, welcome today. Again, I cannot see the chat right now. So when I share my screen, so I'm going to rely on
I'll keep an eye on that for you,
keep
Amy.
an eye and either turn on your mic. I do have a couple of today's session's called Let's Talk, and it's the third one in the last that I've done the last 3 weeks. So this is the one that actually I was hoping to have a little more discussion based. So I do have a presentation. I do have some things I want to talk to you about and share with you. But I do want to open up for conversations at any point in time. That's why it's called Let's Talk. I think so. I'm happy to stop at any time and break into a discussion. That would be great. I would love to do that. So if at any time, there's a lot of, I think, interesting topics that I've covered in the last couple of weeks and today. And so I think it probably would be welcoming to open it up for some conversations. So I'd like to start with the land acknowledgement. And since I'm actually in Toronto at the Seneca's campus today. And so Seneca's campuses are located on the land stewarded by Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat nations. We acknowledge Treaty 13, Toronto Purchase, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa First Nations. We are all interconnected as treaty people with a shared obligation to learn, respect, honor, and sustain. Many of you are joining us from all over Turtle Island, a name many Indigenous peoples use for North America, and also from around the world. And we encourage you to seek out whose ancestral lands you are on today. So as I mentioned, this is the third workshop in the series. It's the last. So I started 3 weeks ago, and I did a workshop on Let's Talk grading. Last week, we talked about alternative and authentic assessments in a workshop called Let's Talk Pizza. And then today it's called Let's Talk, and we're going to talk a little bit more about supports for assessments. So just a little bit about me. If you were not here the last 2 weeks, just quickly, my name is Amy Lynn, and I'm the director of the Teaching and Learning Center at Seneca College in Toronto, Seneca Polytechnic in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And it is Eastern time, so it's actually 1 p.m. for me, so it's pretty good. So I just put up here a few of my favorite things that I love to do. And so you can see that music plays a fairly big part in my life and outside of my academic world. And so I'm currently playing with a duo with a guitarist. We have a band, a duo called Blue Moon. We just released our first album this summer. I also really enjoy playing guitar for the last few years. And that's my Roxy Pink PRS John Mayer guitar. And I also have a COVID dog. So a puppy that I we did bring home during COVID. So it's scared of everything. And that's a little bit about me. I did want to also share a little bit. I don't think I have talked that much about my institution. I think I referred to it during the last couple of weeks in different times, but just a little bit about where I am and what my institution is like for those of you that might be interested where I come from. So I work as a director of the Teaching and Learning Center. So we do everything that is basically the hub of faculty development. So we do everything to support faculty. So I don't work with students very much, but I tend to do a lot of development of resources and supports, courses, conferences, website, resources, everything for faculty and faculty development. But our actual Seneca Polytechnic is the largest college in Canada currently, and we have 39,800 full-time students. This was last year's data. 23,400 part-time and continuing ed students. And we also have, I think I mentioned before, 24,600 students are international students from more than 150 countries. That's pretty typical of institutions that are in the GTA area, in the Toronto area. And so we have over 300 programs. We currently, I think we have more than 25 now, but we had 25 degrees last year. We have 97 diplomas. That would include advanced diplomas and diplomas. And then we also have a lot of micro-credentials. We have community partnerships that you initiated for equity, diversity, and inclusion, for support and services for students. I just wanted to mention that there's just a whole bunch of stats related to the three, what we call, I guess, strategic planning, the three pillars. So one of them is for, we're looking at a more equitable Seneca. And so that's part of that, those community partnerships. We're looking at a more sustainable Seneca, and we actually have 3.9 million bees at 65 hives across our different campuses. And then we also are looking at flexibility. So we want to be able to support more flexible Seneca. And so we have a lot of what we call flexible courses, where they are running in different modalities. So we have something called flex courses, which are running in high flex, and we have over 100 classrooms that are outfitted for that. So we have a large number of students that are currently enrolled in those flexible courses, which allow them to take part in the classroom, either in person, or they can be synchronously online, or they can also join asynchronously. So they have that choice day to day, whatever day the class is on, they can make that choice that day of which modality they want to take part in. And this is really providing as much flexibility as possible for students that might be not in town, that might be in another country or another province or another place, but also to support those who may have families or those who just to make it more flexible for students that come and have jobs and so forth. So that's the idea behind the flexible courses. So I guess in the first session, where we talked a lot about grading culture, we talked about creating creativity and curiosity in a classroom, and then moving from that into assessments and saying, you know, why don't we have assessments that are also about creativity and curiosity? So I talked about pedagogy of voice, and it's really thinking about how to empower students. And I think I ended in the first week with a few sort of takeaways. One is, you know, talking about co-constructing success criteria with our students. And so really involving our students and student voice as much as possible in that process of assessment. We also talked about good questions. And so questions that pique their curiosity, that helps them with critical thinking, problem solving. So really good questions. And that's a good way to think about as we move into thinking about what kinds of assessments we want to ask our students. Work with our students. A couple more points. We talked about learning is messy. So I talked about the classroom and what that would look like, and how to have to promote creativity and problem solving and curiosity, and how you would manage your classroom. And you know, we know that students learn in all different ways. So why do we need to stand in front of the classroom and do that when we know that learning is messy? So that translates as well into the assessments. And so we talked about that last week, more about different types of assessments, more than the traditional assessments. And then I did talk about grading culture and talking about no grades and providing feedback. And then I talked about most recent, most consistent. So thinking about assessments, why would you test somebody at the beginning and not and say that and make that to be and how can that be valid, knowing that they have a whole semester to learn and to grow and to get better at what they're doing. And so providing kind of moving away from grades and providing feedback and having more formative assessments to allow them to go. And I talked about spiraling my courses to allow students to continually have as many tries as possible as the problems or as the concept became more complex. So I like to think of most recent and most consistent. So I did talk about in the last week about authentic assessments and talked about this quote around, I guess I like this quote where it says, how do we make assessment more like life and less like school? So last week, I did focus a bit on what I called alternative assessments and talked about different types of assessments and getting away from traditional ones. It doesn't always have to be authentic assessments. They can be alternative. I gave some examples on digital media, using digital media as a way of assessing students. And then we talked about the differences between traditional and authentic, looked at some examples of authentic assessment and talked about the benefits and some of the challenges around authentic assessments. So I think it's assessment matters when it's ongoing. And so this is about, thinking about assessment not as like one moment in time or at one particular time, but more like an ongoing process. When employers and professional creditors are involved, this is particularly important in our institution, but also when it begins with issues of use and highlights questions that people really care about. So those are some of the examples that we talked about last week. So one way of thinking about your assessment design is just thinking of them more as learning experiences, as opposed to, again, that one as an exam or a test or something where you're taking, or an essay, but really thinking more about a learning experience and then thinking about what they'll be doing when they leave your institution or you leave your classroom. What are the skills and what are the some of even the soft skills and the knowledge that they need to apply to be able to use in their job or in their work term or whatever it is that they're going to be doing. Last week, just to recap, I did talk about engagement and empowerment in assessments. And so this is really focusing on the authentic assessment approach. But I talked about the pizzas. Those of you who were here, basically, I used the pizza metaphor about a restaurant, different types of pizza restaurants that you can go into and what you can choose and what you can have. And really what it comes down to is the more control you have over your assessment, for the students having control over the assessment. So if you are making a pizza and you have total control over the ingredients, you're doing it at home, you know what kind of crust you want, and you have exactly the toppings you want, and you're going to make it. It's not just personalized. It's not just choice, but it's actually more empowering because you actually have some control over the process as well. And that's how I think of an authentic assessment, that it's the most empowering because they have control over, they have some choice, but they also have control over the process. So I always start the workshop talking about, rather than an agenda or goals, I'm just some thinking around what would I want my students to be saying, and so related for today, some of these are the same as before, but relating to today, I like to think that, my culture, identity, learning, or ways of knowing were valued. So that's something I'd like to hear students say. Another would be I was provided feedback that helped me learn and improve. Another would be I was able to reflect upon my learning and can articulate what I know. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and sort of metacognition and reflection of students, of their work. And then the last one is I expect my academic community to act with honesty, trust, fairness, respect, courage, and responsibility. So these are the topics I'd like to talk about today. So I want to talk about the purpose of assessments. I think that kind of to be sort of double back, we've talked more about the types of assessments. We talked about grading, but I think if you don't really dig into what is the purpose of assessments and think about that, you won't feel that why and what and how won't come as easily in terms of creating your assessment. So I think I'm going to start there. I want to talk about culturally responsive assessments. I think we haven't really talked too deeply about that. I want to just touch a bit more on it. I have touched on it a little bit in the past on different aspects of culturally responsive assessments. But I want to just talk a little bit more about that. I want to dig a bit deeper into feedback and evaluation, because I've talked a lot about no grades and providing feedback. And then also, I don't think I can really talk about assessments without touching on academic integrity. And I think and it's something near and dear to my heart. And with, I'm sure, lots of conversations going on at MyFest about artificial intelligence. I don't know, academic integrity and assessments seem to go hand in hand. And so I think that it wouldn't be remiss without having to talk a little bit about that as well. So I'm going to start exactly with what is the purpose of assessment? And I'd like you to, if you can hop onto probably the easiest way to do that, since I can't see the chat. What is the purpose of assessment? So if you go to www.menti.com, and if you enter in the code 92660688, I think we should be able to.
I've got that in the chat for you, Amy.
Thank you. My problem is I don't know if you can see my assessment. Probably not.
Let's see. 2660688, everybody. And I'll bring up the direct link for that.
If somebody can just type something in, then I just want to make sure it's working. Like I can, oh, there we go. All right, so I'm going to stop. Hold on.
Yep, go ahead.
Stop share, because I think I have the other, try to share the other screen right now.
No worries. I put the link. If anyone clicks that link, it should bring you directly to that Menti.
Yeah. So can you see now the screen?
Yep.
With all
Yeah, we're seeing the 2 responses.
Okay. There's only 9 people, so I don't know if everybody answered.
No.
So there.
Love that. Go ahead, people. And feel free to share as well in the chat here if you'd rather do that.
I'm just finally reading the okay. Sorry, I was just looking at the chat. See if there's anything I can answer.
No, there's nothing. I'll bring it to your attention. I'm used to running these sessions, so
Thanks.
I'll team
I was
play
just
for you.
being nosy. Okay.
Nope, go for it. Or you might have private messages too.
So we have some good responses here. So ranking and sorting is interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I would prefer not to think about it as ranking and sorting, but I'll talk about my perspective on that. But for sure, I think traditionally we all know that that's what we've been using grades for. So if you're thinking of assessments relating to grades, definitely ranking and sorting is there. The monitor the learning process as learning progress for sure is to see how they're doing, how they're doing is I think an obvious one. To be sure your students are learning, to discover there's anything you missed or need to teach. So that's interesting because you've related back to also not just how students are learning, but also how you are doing with your students. Encouraging students to study, give support feedback on the learning, so that'll help them to improve, and then checking understanding of a subject or topic, and then verify objectives that have been met. Yep. So those are all great responses to why. So let's just dig a little bit deeper and see what we can do here. So I'm going to come back out and go back to my. There we go. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we had some of your thoughts around purpose of assessment. Where are we here? So let's just listen to this and see a little intro.
In the beginning, assessment was simple. We'd give something a try. It was obvious when we did not succeed. And it was obvious when we did. This became known as learning. Then formal education arrived. And we invented universities and lecture halls, lesson plans, and final exams. We tested students to see if they learned anything. And then we assessed our own effectiveness as teachers through anecdotal questionnaires and subjective end-of-semester surveys. And this might have been enough when we were graduating high school and college students to take predictable jobs with predictable career paths. But today, educators and students are part of a rapidly changing world. 21st century learners must be able to synthesize knowledge, communicate clearly with others, and create solutions to problems that we don't even know exist. Which means students need personalized, engaging, useful feedback on meaningful work, not multiple choice exams and unexplained letter grades. So whether you're teaching accountants, engineers, artists, welders, scientists, or nurses, your students need detailed feedback on meaningful work so they can become learners, not simply graduates.
Cute little introduction to
I like that video.
purpose of assessment. Thank you. It's cute. So I'm going to talk about the 4 purposes of assessment based on Peter Liljedahl from Simon Fraser University had written about this. And I kind of liked what he had to say. So I'm going to share a little bit about his 4 purposes of assessment. One is communication. So he talks about communication between the teacher and the learner, and that is, assessment is a way for students to be able to communicate their learning to their teacher and for the teacher to communicate back to the student and giving a commentary on their learning. He uses a metaphor of navigation. Doesn't show there. Hold on a second. Okay, I'm going to go back. Sorry. So yeah, just a little bit more on communication. So he talks about this metaphor of navigation. So sort of looking at where you are and then where you are going. So the metaphor gives you that framework. It allows you to discuss assessment as communication. Students need to know where they are in their learning and where they're supposed to be going with their learning. And so he talks about that. I think it's also important to think about transparency. So with communication, you kind of have to be very clear about goals for your students or learning outcomes or whatever you use. And so thinking about those goals for not just for the students, but also in our teaching. And so transparency of the goals is important for students to see more clearly where they are going and probably increase the likelihood of getting there. And as this quote says, students can hit any target that they can see. So so that's what, this one about communication is really important. I'm going to keep coming back and talking about communications because it's related to a lot of, I think, that we're going to talk about today. So the next one I wanted to touch on is valuing what we teach. So this is, of course, sort of evaluation is that sort of double-edged sword. When we evaluate our students, they also evaluate us because what we're choosing to evaluate shows to them what we actually value. And so it's really important that when we think about what we're going to evaluate, that we're placing value on something, we're showing the students that we think it's really important. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but when we talk about the academic integrity, there's studies that show that the highest number of infractions in students in classrooms are students who do it in proctored tests or proctored exams. And when they ask the students, why there, a lot of it's because they didn't value what they were learning there. So it wasn't important to them. They said, well, we're just memorizing a lot of facts. We're answering multiple choice questions, short answers. And they didn't see it as cheating because they didn't think it was important. But if you gave them a authentic assessment, something that is personalized, something that they value or that's important to them, and you show that that's what you valued. I think that's a very different case. And so so you can right there can see the impact it might have on integrity as well.
I'll
So
interrupt for the second for a couple
yeah,
of comments there,
sure.
Amy, then I'll give you a chance to breathe. But no, I love that last point about the meta value that we're showing the values that we have by assigning what we want value in evaluating. Let's see. Vivian pointed out that she threw in some things in the platform and the Menti, but there were more questions rather than responses. So those might be good prompts for you. And
Okay.
then I also got a direct message, but I won't call the person out because it was a direct message asking for a copy of the slides. I was going to ask the
Okay.
same thing as well. So,
Yeah.
so I'll pass
So
that along.
I think Yasser had asked me for them last week, and so but I had 3 weeks of
Yeah,
slides.
exactly.
So I'm going to be passing over. I think I don't know where they're posting them, and you may know, Ken. I don't
Yeah,
know where.
actually, if you leave them where you are, I'm the one who's actually uploading a lot of the videos. Maha sends me the links and then I download them, post them on YouTube. But
Okay.
I should be posting the links in the video description of links to slides that people
Okay.
like to share their
Yeah, so I'm
slides.
not
Now that
really
I think about it.
sure. I think so. This is actually there's two ways you can this is actually I use a platform, so
Yeah.
it's based, but I can download PowerPoints
Yep.
as well.
Or we
So
can host them as well. So
okay.
whichever works
So
for you.
by the way, but for sure they will be available. Um,
Thanks.
yeah, so I guess in terms of valuing what we teach, what's important here is feedback. I think we also have to think about the non-curriculum learning goals. So a lot of times we focus so much on the curriculum, we forget about all the other things. And I talked a lot about this in the first week because I talked a lot about how to encourage curiosity and creativity in your classroom, and how to, I guess I talked about surprise and using that whole idea of like surprising your students and having them think and problem solve. So some of those types of grit and perseverance and problem solving and critical thinking doesn't really show up necessarily in your curriculum learning goals. So remembering to that those things are also valuable. I think at Seneca we call them human skills, and so some people call them soft skills, but those are non-curriculum goals that I think you have to take into consideration. Not necessarily everything has to have a mark attached to it as well. So remember that what you value and what you teach can be just in the feedback and then in observations and conversations that you have with them. So again, in the course of communication comes back here as well. The third one is about reporting out. And this is kind of interesting because it's difficult to think about assessment these days, especially in Ontario, especially where I am, and especially when you're in K-12, the government, and it's always talking about reporting on assessments, right? Reporting for information on groups of students, student progress within our college. Of course, we're always collecting data. So it's all about, it's not all about, but a lot of to do some kind of purposes of assessments is sometimes to gather information to report on your students' progress. So what happens is we end up reducing our report to a single mark or a percentage or letter grade. And if you do an aggregate of a student's performance of a large number of learning goals, and then you bring it down to one letter or one number, I think it really doesn't say a lot about that student. You're not going to know a lot about that student. I think I asked that in the first week. If you have a student that comes to your classroom from last, and you were told that last year his mark in the course was 75, what do you actually know about that student? Because you're not going to know very much as an aggregate score about everything that he or she did in that classroom. So it's not it's not valuable. So it's important when you're thinking about data or thinking about collecting information or student achievement that you maybe consider disaggregated formats, and then take that information and be able to see what needs improvement. So just a little bit different, not sort of typically what we think about when we report out on student data. And the last one is, I think someone talked about sorting and ranking, and I think there's a significant societal, assumption that one of the main purposes of assessment is to sort or rank our students. And it's, again, back to that aggregated letter or percentage. So the letter grade using for sorting, and then I think percentages more for ranking to represent a whole of a student's learning. But I think there's just, you have to be so careful because there's a much more subtle and more sort of damaging indicator of this, and that's equitability, or whether you're addressing all students equally or not. So I guess thinking about approaching assessment from the perspective of sorting and ranking can be problematic. I think it presupposes that our assessment instruments are objective and infallible enough to actually accurately represent a student's attainment of a curriculum goal with just using that single mark that you've given them. And I think that presupposition is probably ridiculous. And so you can think that it was probably pretty difficult to be able to make that kind of conclusion. I talked about that idea of average, I think 2 weeks ago, that there is no average student, or it was last week, and I told a story about the pilot seats, and instead of realizing that there was no average, pilot, and so that they created a seat that was average, yet nobody could fit into it. So that idea that we have to adapt, we have to make it so things are adjustable. So when the pilot is sitting in the seat, they can adjust everything around them to make it fit for them, rather than we try to fit the pilot, because there is no average pilot. So there is no average student. So we have to allow them to, we have to be able to adapt to the different, for the students have to be able to adapt. So when you think about ranking and sorting and those types of assessments, you're really ignoring that individuality of students. And so, of course, that doesn't make any sense. We need to accept that we need differentiated assessments, just like we did with differentiated instruction. Okay, so I want to talk about supporting student success, and I want to talk about impact of assessment strategies on learning success. So
I'll pass on some comments here as well to you, Amy, since I know you're probably not looking. So Sybil I mentioned ranking and sorting because when I heard that phrase, it hit me that I wasn't really looking for learning at all. It was an epiphany for me. And then also commented yes to the no average student. I feel this way. And then I put a comment, but I won't repeat my own. And then Vivian says, in my experience, assessment is about quantitative data, hence the average in parentheses or in quotation marks. I don't know how assessment could become more qualitative, plus the overlap with grading. Actually, I'll put mine in. I talked about ranking is so embedded. Often students are looking for it. They're expecting it. I've got quite a bit of background in ungrading, and that's things that surprised me when I went ungrading and students were pushing back on it.
Yeah, students have spent a lot of years before they come to a post-secondary education or institution. They spent a lot of their years. I mean, there's lots of ungrading happening in K-12 now. I think it's actually in your old province, British Columbia, right? That they don't have any grades anymore up until grade 9, I believe. So there, it's starting to pop up in different places. I was ungrading when I was teaching in high school, and that was like 10 years ago. So, but I was the only person in the entire school. So, but I know that school now.
Same
number. Yeah. So now I see like a lot of more, but the students, I thought the biggest aha moment for me was just when students, were no more like, you would have an assessment and you would give it back to them. I taught math. And so, think about math test, right? Or something, or a math assignment, and they would get it back. And instead of the first thing that happens is, they would look at their mark, or they want to, I want to have a higher mark, or can I get a mark here or there? And they're, like, instead of sort of worrying about all that, it's not there anymore. Right. And so it's neat to sort of think about like, listening to them talk about the learning, right? Like, oh, I learned this, or I figured how to do this now. And so they're sort of thinking about mastery and learning, and their focus is on that instead of focusing on what mark did I get and what mark did you get. So it was a big eye opener, and it was very cool to see them switch over. It was definitely much more engaging and much more fun. And we had provincial tests. And so all my students would have to take the provincial tests, just like everybody else, the exam, the standardized tests, and they did great. So I knew they were learning, and I didn't worry that I didn't have a whole slew of marks to show it. So this is an
Thank you.
interesting survey that I wanted to share with you. So we have a course that we developed for the Ministry of Education. Well, it's actually for eCampus Ontario. It's called Rethinking Assessment. I think somewhere in these slides, either last week or this week, or if not, I'll make sure it's in there. But there is a link. It's Creative Commons, so it's open. You can use any or all of it. Part of it has everything. You can take videos out of it. You can do anything you want with it. It's 4 modules based on rethinking assessment. And I think it's, I've touched and used some of it through these presentations. And I give credit to my team here at Seneca who worked on it for a year, as well as University of Ottawa and Algonquin College and Durham College. And so there's a number of institutions who work together on this rethinking assessment course, and it is free for anyone to use. So I will, somewhere in here, there's a link, but I'll make sure there is a link to it. So before we started that whole project, we actually did a survey to look at the impact of assessment strategies on learning success. And we looked at and some of the things that sort of happened from the survey that we looked at. So one is that we found that particular types of assessments provided a better way to demonstrate learning. So students indicated to us that assignments, take home, and open resource book assessments were preferred methods for online learning, and projects and open-ended assessments for them reduced the stress and improved their performance. So that was one takeaway from the survey. The other was about time. Time allocated was insufficient for the number and complexity of questions. So students perceived that traditional assessments, such as quizzes or tests or exams, were constructed with faculty concerns about academic integrity, right? So they were thinking about academic integrity when they created these because they were worried about online cheating, rather than actually thinking about assessing the student learning, their understanding, or application. So this results in tests that were allocated with too little time for the types of questions asked and details that were required, and they found them to be excessively difficult. And so they didn't think that there was consideration for increased workload, what was happening to them during the pandemic, remote study requirements, or students having to actually teach or reteach themselves. So that was another thing that came out of the survey. The next one is about the use of certain types of technology added to unnecessary stress. Now, remember, some of these questions were about online assessing online. So they were talking about using remote proctoring software that really created a lot of stress and concerns, and also felt that that was an invasion of privacy and created an inequitable testing environment. So I do talk about integrity later on. So if you have questions around proctoring, I can answer those. For sure. So, and another few things that came out of the survey was that feedback was minimal, it was insufficient or absent. So they felt that the feedback that they were getting, if they were getting any, was actually very slow, wasn't timely. It wasn't specifically helpful for them, and it sort of impeded their ability to actually monitor their progress, gauge the amount of work required to be successful, and provide guidance and opportunities for them to improve. The other thing that came out of the survey was a need for appropriate assessment frequency. So they didn't feel like they were getting enough feedback. They would prefer to have more frequent, smaller assessments, low stakes, that should be more helpful, that would provide them more helpful feedback and gave them more chances to improve and not become overwhelmed or just turn, just talking about assessment, just actually completing assessments without actually learning anything. The other is the need for flexibility and room for creativity. So students recommended that flexibility and understanding from instructors when they are trying to adjust to assessment methods and approaches, especially with learning online. and allowing them to have some creativity and expression of learning and understanding. So different ways to show what they know and include flexibility for the delivery of their assessments relative to the access of the technology. So we talked about that. Also, they talked about the challenges of having access to technology. So the need for flexibility and creativity there as well. So those are sort of the key things that and considerations that came out of that survey on impact of assessment strategies on success. All right, so before I talk a little bit about, I want to talk about cultural responsive assessments. I do just want to ensure that we understand, or that we have a common understanding of what assessment, evaluation, and grading means, and just being able to separate those. So assessment actually comes from a Latin word, assidere, I guess, meaning to sit beside. So when we're assessing students, we're really just simply gaining information about what that student knows and what they can do. So we have to ensure that when we're doing that, that we're getting information that's valid and reliable. And we also have to be clear about what we expect the students to know and be able to do. And we have to be certain that the tools that we're using don't prevent students from being able to show us that. So I guess if I gave a paper and pencil exam to a student, but that student has fine motor delays or can't read very well or can't write very well, or doesn't speak the language in which I've written this pencil paper exam, I'm not really assessing what the student knows. I'm kind of assessing how well they can read or write or understand the language. And that means that the data that I'm collecting is going to be flawed, right? It's not going to be correct data. Evaluation really comes into play. It's when I put the data up against standards and decide if it's good ensure So I have to know what good enough looks like, and I have to be able to trust my data. So I have to ensure that I'm looking at it through a lens that's free of bias, and I have to ensure that it's good enough or the same, I guess, for all of the students to be able to for that evaluation. So when I put my data up against standards, I have to make sure that I'm seeing a good distribution of students at all levels. And so, for example, my white cisgendered affluent kids are maybe meeting the standard really well, but everyone else is falling below, for example. So that means there's not necessarily a problem with the kids. It's probably going to be me and my system. So I need to relook at that. And then in terms of grades, I think is just really a means of how we communicate to the outside world what our students know and can do according to our standards and our data collection system. And so you can imagine all the different kinds of problems that surround grades. And I think we talked about them in their first week, but you can imagine trying to understand what that grade means based on how we got those grades. So the first thing I did talk about UDL, and I think there was a nutshell or little assignment, I guess I gave everyone to do in the first week on UDL and assessments. But just to remind you, with Universal Design for Learning, that you are aligning your assessments to learning goals, reduce unnecessary barriers for access, and supporting learner variability through flexible assessments, and making sure that you clarify your expectations. And using this is all part of UDL. So just a reminder of that. And also making sure that we are always thinking about accessibility and creating accessible documents. There's a link here that goes to a toolkit that we use for accessibility for our AODAs, or our actual requirements for accessibility when we create documents. So what I really wanted to spend a little bit of time on today was looking at culturally responsive assessment practices, which I guess I didn't have much time to touch on that last week. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some strategies here and some things to think about. So first of all, I think when you're thinking about culturally responsive assessments, I think there's three things that we need to consider. One is making sure that the learning is meaningful, really helping students think about their learning, foster cultural competence, and promote socio-political consciousness. So those are three things that you can think about. How are we going to do all this? So I'm going to start with looking at assessments that incorporate Indigenous worldviews and pedagogies, and decolonizing and indigenizing assessment practices. So I think the first thing, thinking about decolonization and indigenization. So decolonization refers to removing or reducing the colonial biases inherent in their assessment and feedback practices, and indigenization involves creating space for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis worldviews and ways of knowing when we ask our students to demonstrate what they have learned. So I am not an expert, and I'm constantly learning in this area. And I think that we can all work towards including decolonization and indigenizing our practices into our assessment strategies. And I think we can do it in various ways. So I think, first of all, I think, in a good way, we want to learn about Indigenous culture, history, traditions, and perspectives. I think we can move forward in this pathway, becoming much more aware of our shared colonial history, the treaties, our role of educators in supporting truth and reconciliation. And we do have I will put the link in here as well. We do have an open access resource that we created called SCODEN. And it's a lot of our faculty faculty and staff at Seneca have taken this course, and we created an open access resource for that course that will help support, I think, the truth and reconciliation journey for our faculty. I think it's important to foster relationships with our local Indigenous communities, our elders and knowledge keepers. We recognize the diversity among Indigenous cultures and their perspectives. So we practice gratitude and reciprocity within these relationships for the knowledge and the insights shared by them. Where appropriate, we try to include Indigenous inspired assignments, and we also ensure their assignments are respectful of the Indigenous peoples and protocols. So
thank you for that as well. And I'll interrupt. There's some things in the chat here as well. Thank you for that, by the way. It's really important. Danielle asked, what methods do you recommend for determining if an assessment is valid and reliable? In an ideal world, well-designed research achieves this goal, but is too costly and lengthy. So what do you suggest instead?
So I guess the question there is, I guess it's more about, and I guess your experience, Ken, would probably help on this as well, but I think it's more of when you switch from, people think that, the robust and reliable and comes with a test, right? Or
the things that are easy to measure.
Yeah, it's easy to measure. It seems reliable. Or that
it's
is
a
reliable.
Normal curve on the grading.
So I guess it's when you're switching from that to an authentic assessment, and now you're using a rubric and you're giving feedback, and it's a different process. So have you now changed anything in terms of reliability? I guess, I don't know. I guess I never thought I was. I thought that if I have a carefully designed rubric, and I know what my learning outcomes are going to be, and if I can meet those learning outcomes through that assessment and align it, I'm confident that it's reliable. So I don't know, comments? What did you think, Ken? Because you must have gone through the same thing.
Yeah, it's not my session, but it's a very difficult question to answer, and there's so much context wrapped up in this, and culture of your institution, culture of your department. And as a foreigner working in Mexico, I get away with so much stuff because I'm a foreigner living in Mexico, and I can do things that my colleagues can't, including being that lone experimenter in ungrading. What I think the trick is there is, I would say, is talk to the students and see how their reactions are. Are they getting the feedback they think they need on their learning journey in your course? And in reality, the answer is never available until a semester, 2 or 3 or 4 years later, when they come back to you and discuss how, yeah, now I get why you were doing what you were doing with us in those courses and how you're evaluating. And it's helped me in my my learning as a professional after I graduated from my undergraduate. So these are really hard questions now,
I
for
think one thing,
sure.
one thing you should do, or one thing you could do for sure, is to disaggregate your data. So try to have a better understanding of not just like, one score or one grade for
Mhm.
a whole bunch of things. So disaggregate. So look at what your learning outcomes are, and then try to look at how they're doing, in those learning outcomes. So trying to align your, your results of your assessment and disaggregated with your learning outcomes will give you a much better idea of, how well the students are doing in each of those parts and how valid your particular questions are, right? For
Right.
those learning outcomes. So that's probably what I would do as a start in terms of, rather than just having one score for our students saying, oh yeah, they're doing great, because we don't
Yeah.
really know if they're doing great. Yeah.
It's a much better answer than mine. And then Vivian put culturally responsive in quotation marks. Anything may not always settle well, especially now in 2023 in the US with the DEI issues. And then commented as well regarding Indigenous culture. And then thank you for doing this. I'm currently exploring my background because I'm Métis from Cree background. Through the I grew up in the 70s, so there's all sorts of repression of Indigenous culture back then that I have to deal with. But in segregated and straight up historically racist places, this work is challenging, teaching students and educators to recognize Indigenous epistemology. And you're right. You're right. And I'm so happy to see in my native Canada, this is becoming much more into the forefront. As someone who left Canada in the early 90s, it wasn't back then. And it is so much more now. And I'm happy
is.
about that.
It's slow, like considering TRC was almost 9 years ago. So I
Yeah.
mean, I find the progress to be slow,
Yeah.
but we're working on it. And we have to work on it in a meaningful way too. And so
True.
it's not just a checkbox like, oh, we took this course, or I read this
Yeah.
article, or this is the book we read. It has to be meaningful, and we're trying to do the work in context of
Yeah.
their studies, right? So how does this impact, have discussions in the classroom, how does it impact what I'm doing and what I'm going to be doing in my community? So I think that's also really important.
No, and thank you for that. My view is also, as even though I'm Canadian, is as an external watching things from so far away in Mexico. But I do see change, and I am happy for the change we've achieved. But there's so much more to go. Vivian, you opened your camera there for a second. I don't know if you wanted to jump in the conversation since it's called Let's Talk.
Yeah, I'm on the big island of Hawaii, and right now there's some trouble with wildfires on different islands. So I'm trying to keep up with what's going on. But in my experience, so like I taught in ethnic studies for 10,000 years in California. Here in Hawaii, there's a lot of pushback regarding, for example, Indigenous epistemology. What? I guess, yes, and yes. And then I am a person who is not Indigenous to the area where I live. And there is a lot of anti-Native pushback amongst my students and colleagues. And I mean, I'm listening and I'm trying to think about how stuff could have possibly apply here. Of course, for me, being here in the middle of the Pacific is somewhat like being on another planet. And so these issues are issues that I have experienced. But I mean, from the get-go, it's like, hey, hybrid classes, I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have a simultaneously face-to-face and Zoom class, teaching that. I already have enough issues teaching just a Zoom class. And when you try and mix it, and I have done that, it's not mentally healthy for anybody, for me as the teacher. And then all of these things of like trying to do these yes, 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 and yes. For my entire adult life, I've been doing these things. What has come back? How has this been responded to? I'm here on Zoom and just like talking into my screen. I'm sorry, I'm stepping in. I haven't been in the other meetings for this section, so forgive me.
Yeah.
Just having some issues here, trying to figure out like how my experiences as a person who is not privileged and yet is in a specific community, teaching in a specific institution, and having run assessment before. And I teach Freire style, whatever style, as much as possible. And it's just like, you know, how can all of this actually be some? I was thinking that maybe we would be able to talk about like what is it, like assessments with students and effort as opposed to outcome. But I don't know if that's part of your program for today. So let me just stop talking. Thanks.
Yeah, well, we can talk about anything, but those are great, actually great insights there to think about. Thank you for sharing those. And I'm going to make a comment on, I think you're talking about HyFlex. We went on that journey a couple of years ago, wanting to have that flexibility, and your feelings and many faculty's feelings are very similar. It wasn't an easy process. We know a lot of other colleges around here and institutions who have decided not to go down that pathway. We still know, because we've done the research with the students, that they really want it. They want that flexibility. They want to be able to engage in have those choices. So we're pursuing it. But it took a lot of work. First of all, it takes a lot of technology to be in place that works and is reliable and people are trained to use it. Because the worst thing is to be in the middle of class and something doesn't happen. Your microphone stopped working and you can't hear the students, or you can't see the students. And that's the worst thing that can be when you're trying to start something different. So that was a big investment. The second is the training. Like, it was so much training that had to go on and support. We did practice sessions. We were in classrooms with faculty, working with them. We did courses that they were taking on how to teach in the 3 modalities. And we worked on creating online courses. We call them Good to Great, working on. So it's just a lot of work. So it didn't come naturally. It wasn't something easy. And your sentiments were very much the same as the sentiments and the faculty here. And to bring them to the place where they're comfortable with it and not feeling stressed about it was a lot of training and a lot of support. So it's not going to happen unless you have that. So I think that's one observation for sure I noticed. So I just wanted to I noticed you commented on that on the chats. I wanted to just say that. So don't feel badly that it's tough, because it is tough. And it takes time. We gave our faculty all time to look at their courses and how to make them available for HyFlex. So there's that.
Yeah, it was hard. Definitely HyFlex. I had the same thing, and it was only one semester where we were kind of had to do it in fall 2021, but I offered it for my groups the next semester as well, even though most, including my daughter, went to full back in person. But I wanted to offer it to my students, but it was so hard, and I didn't have any support. It was just us doing it as teachers.
Yeah, it's
So
not
yeah,
going to work.
I hear you,
unless there's a lot
Vivian.
of
I
support.
hear you. It was so hard. It was stressful for
I
us.
do too. Yeah. Okay, I'm just gonna skip over that one for a sec. Time. So I think this, I don't, I guess I touched more on, I think, what Vivian was talking about in terms of grades and feedback and effort and so forth last week. We can come, I think I might touch on it again when we talk about assessments and evaluations, but I just wanted to talk a little bit here about, I don't want to spend a lot of time on rubrics because I know that most of you know how to use a rubric. There are lots of fantastic resources online on rubrics, but people do, that's probably one of the most common one of the most common questions I get when I talk about authentic assessments and alternative assessments is, how do we evaluate that? And, what is the best way to evaluate that, the student work? So, so a rubric is the assessment tool that, is usually suggested for this. I don't necessarily love rubrics myself, so I love the single point rubric, which I talked about a couple of sessions ago. But the rubric is a good tool if designed properly, can define that. If you define that criteria, you can evaluate your student submissions and be able to look at using the rubric. So I'm not going to talk about how to create a rubric, but I just wanted to mention that about that. There are the two types of rubrics, though, the holistic ones and the analytic. The holistic ones is more of like, I often, like I said, I use a single point. It kind of gives you a good snapshot of what's happening and gives you some, not really going into a lot of detail. I use it a lot for formative type feedback and maybe on a draft, a draft assignment or something that you're collecting to see how the progress is. The analytic is, of course, much more specific, and it will have that sort of determined parts of that assessment, probably the one that you're more familiar with those grids, specifying your levels of achievement, how that's aligned with the categories, with your learning outcomes, and then a description of what you're required for in that rubric. So I do want to move into feedback a little bit before so I'm looking at the time here. So just thinking about effective feedback, I talked about feedback the last 3 weeks all the time, and I guess I never really talked about how to give effective feedback. But I guess if you think about it, there's when I first saw this, I saw this feedback and feed forward. I thought it was kind of cute. So I added the feed up and feed down. I don't know if they make any sense, but anyhow, in terms of feedback, it really is about like, how am I doing? And am I moving towards mastery? So it's really taking, it's like the learning processes related to the learning intention or the task. When you give the feed forward, I guess, is thinking of making sure students know where to go next. It would outline the next steps for students. What do I need to improve? And then feed up is more about focusing on the learning intentions. And this is important because I don't think we always do that, right? We don't think about the learning intentions. So going back, like, what are your goals? What are the learning outcomes? And then where am I going to? And then I just added the feed down again too. I don't know, it doesn't really make sense, but I think that it's important that you think about the metacognition, right? So can I explain what I need to do and what can I share with my peers? And so this is, so I think of more of the feed downs more than metacognition. It's really interesting because when we worked with students here who were coming out of going into interviews for their work, integrated learning. So they may be interviewing for a co-op term or something like that. And they have difficulty articulating what it is that they know, what they have learned. So, they can see that they were successful. They've got, their transcripts and they know that they've completed these courses, but they can't actually articulate what it is that they can do. So I think it's important that, as we're thinking about feedback for our students, that they actually can explain where they are, how they're doing, what they need to do, and it can talk about that with their peers and with their professors. And so we noticed that was lacking, that they weren't able to actually articulate what they know. So in terms of feedback, I think of it as like 3 different levels of feedback. So the first level is sort of your basic, not that useful. but there's sort of a personal level, a personal evaluation about your student, so that was a really good answer. You did that really well. Well done. And that's sort of your personal level. You want to move it up to a task level. Then you can describe how well a task was performed. And then you can also give some advice or offer some directions on how you would improve. So could you include more information about this, or can you provide, a different type of graphic here? Can you provide some data so you can help them move on to the next level? And then the process is the most, I think, the highest level, I guess, of feedback, where you're really going to focus on how the student has completed the task and actually offer guidance and information on how to improve their sort of processing, their deeper processing and mastery of that task. So this one, so you're actually giving them, advice and saying, well, you might find it valuable if you read this out loud and you share it with a friend, and then it will help you improve the flow. So something like that. So you're really focusing not just on sort of the, the lower levels of feedback, but on the higher level, you're really focusing more on how they actually completed the task, and then how they can, what they can actually do to improve that, and to give a deeper dive into what they're doing. So that's the 3 levels of feedback. There's a lot of do's and don'ts for feedback. I just wrote a few here. In terms of don't, or things to avoid, and these are, things that I've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, avoid just only giving a mark or a grade without feedback. And I hope nobody does that. Try to avoid comparing students with each other. I think that's pretty obvious. Try to avoid extrinsic rewards. Stay away from that sort of non-specific or general feedback. It's not very useful. Try to avoid giving them feedback that's not related to the critical aspects of their learning goals or learning outcomes, and try to avoid giving them too much information. Don't overload them with too much information or too much written feedback. So try to think about other ways of giving feedback. On the do side, lots of things that you can think of as the best kind of feedback. Making sure they link to the learning outcomes is very important. Timing, making sure that not only that it's timely, that it is, it makes sense in the part of the learning process. It's conversational. Feedback shouldn't just be one way. You should be a conversational two-way. And then I think it's important if you can use self or peer assessment along with your feedback, and addressing strengths and weaknesses. I think most people know that. Focus on effort, what you said, rather than success. And then make sure you check for clarity and effectiveness with the student. Make sure you give time for students to reflect, to respond to it, and to act on it, and also to help guide the ongoing learning. So those are some of the things that would be the best kind of feedback, and then some things that you'd want to avoid. Okay, before I go into academic integrity, are there any more questions or thoughts? Nope. We're good?
Oops, I was muted.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know. Danielle asked a question. I don't know if that was
Okay.
for me or for you, because I was
didn't hear
commenting in
it,
the
yeah.
chat. I double muted myself because I was talking to my kids and I was worried I was going to come through over the audio. It seems lucky and rare for the institution to have a team like yours interact with students so much. I think that might have been for me, Danielle. That kind of interaction is so useful for improving our work as instructional designers and educational developers. But in over 20 years in online learning in various places, I rarely had that opportunity. What is your institution driving? And maybe Danielle answered me there. Oh, it's for Amy. So good.
Sorry.
I was trying to get it out of the context of our chat messages as well.
So
What is your institution doing that allows you to talk to students so much?
We
What is
have
Seneca doing well?
Yeah, so we have just like we have communities that we work with, our industry partners and our stakeholders. We also have communities of students that we interact with. So we gather information from them. This is new. This is not something that we've always done, but we're starting to involve students more and more in the processes of gathering information, making improvements, creating modules, creating in the instructional design stages. And so we're definitely valuing their input and including them into those processes. So our last couple of projects, yes, when we just created some academic integrity games, for example, we literally we used our students through the entire process, right from ideation right to reviewing them and getting feedback. So I think we do think it's really important, but it's not something that's happened a lot until more recently. So yeah, I think if you can in your institution be able to have access to students and having a really good relationship with things like our student federation, and having a really good relationship with them. So whenever I need anything, I go to the president and their team and talk to them and say, I need this. I need to get some input from students. I need students to be part of this survey. I need students for part of these focus groups. Can you help me? And they are always very, very helpful too.
Good. Yeah, I linked the About the Teaching and Learning Center that I Googled up here for my Seneca as well, and linked that for people. But but Daniel's got a great point. Because often faculty are all talking about, well, are you thinking about what students will think? And I said, why don't we just ask them?
Yeah, exactly. It's true. But and we also think a lot about, I find a lot of faculty are still focused on, like if you're talking about assessment, they're thinking about, like, that's why I didn't spend a lot of time on rubrics. I think a lot of times they're always asking like, well, how am I going to do this? I don't have time. And there's a lot of challenges that they bring forward to us. And so I think sometimes I think you got to go back and remember that you're doing this for the students and the outcome, want the students to be successful. So what do we need to do to help them be successful? And start, if we have that in mind, sometimes it makes the other parts a little easier to move through. So we can think more of it in terms of what the students need, as opposed. So I always get them to think about, to identify what the student learning needs are first, rather than sort of what do you want or what you're needing, what you need as being secondary, I guess. So I don't think that we can really get away with talking about assessment without talking about academic integrity. And I'm kind of, I think about this a lot. So I do a lot of work at our institution on academic integrity. And I actually just came back from presenting at the European Conference on Ethics and AI academic integrity. There was a ton of stuff on artificial intelligence there. And so I think it would be, so I just wanted to share with you my thoughts on integrity and how I look at it in terms of assessment. We do define academic integrity at Seneca. We use the ICAI definition that it's a commitment in the face of adversity to the 6 fundamental values of honesty, truth, fairness, respect, courage, and responsibility. So that's what we use. We are really focused on building a culture of academic integrity and moving away from the punitive approach, but more of the educational approach. So when we first went online, we went through a lot of students going online and Flex, and I was just inundated with emails, and just like I'm inundated with emails now about artificial intelligence. So once that happened, everybody was like, my students cheat way more. I got way more infractions and all that. So, I always bring them back to, let's just think about why students cheat. So they cheat because they're disengaged. They see little value in the learning of the assignment. They cheat because they're under a lot of stress and pressures. I have a lot of international students who are under particular pressures from their families at home and not wanting to disappoint them. Students cheat when assessments rewards performance rather than mastery, where there's extrinsic goals as opposed to intrinsic goals, when they have poor instructions, when they're not clear and they don't know where to turn to get clarity on those instructions. And then, of course, it can be misunderstanding of academic integrity infractions, just didn't know that was cheating. None of these happen purely online or purely in person. They happen both online or in person. So if you really think about why students cheat, I think we found, and through our studies here, that there were particular types of infractions that seem to be higher in when we went online, but not necessarily more. So I guess I'll go backwards. I'll start with the end. This is something I use with my faculty all the time when we talk about academic integrity, that we're really about promoting a culture of academic integrity. So we're not thinking about punishing them, or we don't think about suspensions and expulsions, and not from the student conduct point of view, but really thinking about it from the educational point of view. So I think about it in three ways. I talked a lot about engagement and power already last couple of weeks, about how to engage and empower your students. And letting them be part of that process. We just talked about involving them. But the continuous communication is the other one, and meaningful measure. So those are my sort of three mantra around how to promote a culture of academic integrity at your institution, whether it's remote or in person. And so continuous communication. So this is about the education. So we do a lot of work on promoting our policies and having them learn about infractions. We have 3 micro-credentials where they earn badges in academic integrity at Seneca. And currently, I think when I last looked, we were about 210,000 badges have been awarded in the last I guess it's now in place for 2.5 years. So a lot of students have completed these tutorials. And I think they're not necessarily the answer to everything, but it's a really great introduction and really helps them understand and see scenarios and look at and understand more about what is cheating and what isn't. I really focus with my faculty on clear instructions, ensuring that they do have clear instructions. So when you're giving an assessment, that you are very clear as this is group work, this is individual work. This one you can go and use artificial intelligence and use that to create this part. But then when you go to this part, this is you're on your own, or you're going to do this part on your own. So you just what are the instructions? What those are really clear. If they're not, and being able to be there to answer the questions and give support is really important. And when it comes to support, we're not just talking about a professor being there to support their students, to answer questions. We're also talking about support in the institution as well. So students need time management in that 11th hour when they're really struggling, and they think, I think I might contact that essay mill that I read about, that we have, chatbots that can answer their questions and hopefully steer them away until the morning, so they can get clarity as to what they need help with. So those are all really important in terms of communications. I've talked about this already, meaningful measures, and so this is focusing on alternative and authentic assessments for our students. And so we talk about authentic assessments. So thinking about authentic assessments by design. If we look at scaffolding support, real world scenarios, focusing on the learning outcomes, ensuring that they're differentiated using UDL, and looking at personalization. And if those all come together for an authentic assessment, we actually hit 2 things. We can increase student engagement in that assessment, and we can also reduce the violations of academic integrity. So I guess I pretty much done here in terms of what I wanted to talk about today. So in terms of just a recap, in the first session, so if you're interested in looking at the slides from the last 3 weeks, or the slide packages or slide decks, the first week I focused a lot on how to pique curiosity, have students be creative. How do you ask good questions? How do you engage your students in the classroom? Because I think that's really important as a basis of, if you do that in your classroom for your lessons, why are you not doing that for your assessments? And so, why would you, encourage students to problem solve and do these project-based learning and all these great things, and then you go to a 2-hour sit down exam. And so it doesn't make any sense. And so it's really thinking about how you do that in your classroom and how you would do that with your assessments as well. And then I talked a lot about grading culture, because that was, something I was very passionate about. So we talked about grading culture and grading. What does it mean? I called it, assessing for equity, I guess, as opposed to ungrading, and thinking about the different ways that you can assess for equity. And the last week was really focused on authentic assessments, alternative assessments, and digital media assessments. And so some good examples there, some things like what authentic assessments, what it is and what it isn't. And then to this week, touching a bit more on cultural responsive assessments, feedback and evaluation, and then just a little bit on academic integrity. Yeah, so I guess, well, I have to give you this quote because it's in all my, it's important to me. So Seymour, this is my favorite quote. The role of the teacher is to create the conditions for invention rather than provide ready-made knowledge. So I always have to have that quote because it means a lot to me. And there, so I was just gonna, at this point, open it up to conversation or to any questions. And I guess some of the things I'd like to hear about, what do you feel are, the roles of students and professors in assessment? How do your students actually earn points? I guess is a way of putting it. Are there students who have an easier time gaining, having higher grades or not? And why do you think that? Do you have any go-to tools for assessment? And if you do they favor anybody? Do they leave anybody out? It's just things to think about. It was just something I thought about. I'll be happy to talk about anything or answer any questions that you have regarding any of those topics.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy. If we have questions, and by the way, that's an excellent quote. I agree. Definitely one to put in any slide deck.
Thank you.
Questions, comments from everybody there online? I have to say, this was an excellent use of an hour and a half of my time today. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
I was signed up to host, but I wanted to be here anyway. Anything from Sybil or Vivian, Joe? Oh, thank you, Sybil. Ditto, excellent use of my time. Thank you. Vivian's got her hand up. Go ahead, Vivian.
First, are our comments and questions being recorded? They are, yeah.
I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but I can always pause the recording at any time if someone feels comfortable having it paused.
Looks like we're done talking, so lower your hand up. Yeah, could we pause?
Yep, no problem. Here we go. So I can record that we're saying thank you to Amy for the session today and allowing us to talk. And thank you everyone who's been participating as well. Thank you. Thank you all for participating. And this was excellent. It's great. I'm glad I was here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any closing things, Amy? You put up your name on the slides there for anyone who has the chat. You remember you can click on the little 3-button hamburger menu and say save the chat. There might be some links in there that are useful. I linked to the Teaching and Learning Center where Amy is at, and her contacts there as well. Yep. And there's the email in the chat.
For sure, email me if you have any questions, and I will clean it. I just want to go back and clean up a couple of the slides, and then I'll send the decks over to you after. So I assume that they'll be posted. Yeah, the link will be there.
Thank you so much, Amy, and everybody have an excellent rest of your day, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world.
Yeah, thank you, Kim.
Thank you. It was so nice to meet you, Amy. Thank you. Thank you.